Boker Tov. Welcome into Mishkan Katan this morning. It's great to have you here. I hope that if you've been following along with our study on the Psalms, that you're ready to go for another installment this morning. Before we get started, I'd like to just share a little bit from my personal life. It's been a difficult week. I told you in my last broadcast that I would be going to a Messianic conference this past weekend, and I did. I don't know that you would call it a conference. I just had trouble thinking of a better word for it, but it was more like a gathering of ministry leaders from all over, and there were probably about 100 people there. It was a time of intense worship, fellowship. I made a lot of new friends. However, shortly after I arrived at the place where it was held, I received some very sad and disturbing news. I'll get to that in just a minute. But first, I want to tell you about where it was held. This was very interesting. I meant to research this, and I just, you'll understand why. I sort of ran out of time. But if you're of a certain age, you may remember a Christian theme park called Heritage USA that existed, I'm guessing, back in the 80s or something. But at any rate, it was a Christian theme park, so-called. And at one time, it was the second most attended theme park in the United States after Disneyland. But Heritage USA was very successful until the people who started it, Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, fell into some difficulties, shall we say, and their ministry sort of imploded. And as a result, Heritage USA ceased to be in that current form, and it was bought and sold, and eventually it was bought by a man whose name is Rick Joyner, I believe. I believe I have this right. I really should have looked this up. But at any rate, they took the attractions at the theme park, and they sort of got rid of those, and they kept the main building, which is beautiful, although it's quite old now. Well, it's relatively speaking. And now you can go to a conference there. So if you look at the hashtag Heritage Conference Center, you should be able to find some information about that. But it's located in South Carolina, near Charlotte, near the South Carolina-North Carolina border. And it was really a nice place. I really enjoyed being there from that standpoint. It was a great place for meetings. It'd be a great place for a wedding venue or whatever. But at any rate, that's where it was held, and got to meet lots of new ministry leaders, as I said, enjoyed wonderful worship and encouraging teaching. And then, however, less than 24 hours after I arrived, I received news that my dear family member, one of my husband's close relatives, who we knew was ailing. We knew he was ailing, but we just didn't realize how bad off he was. He went into what I call the death coma less than 24 hours after I arrived at the venue. And because I had ridden to the event with a friend, I was unable to leave. And my husband told me not to leave because we didn't know how quickly things were going to progress. Well, it turns out they progressed quite quickly, and I received news early Sunday morning. My husband called me around 7:20 to tell me that his loved one had passed, and passed on into the arms of the Lord. He was a believer, and we know where he is, but of course I was very distraught and couldn't get home fast enough. So we had his funeral yesterday. And honestly, folks, it is only by the grace of God that I have teaching to present to you this morning from the Psalms. It's only by His grace and mercy, because after I got home, I was exhausted from the stress and strain of all that, and I just wasn't sure I was going to be able to be ready. But God is gracious and good, and so now we're ready to jump into Psalms 9 through 13 this morning. So please grab your copy of the scriptures. I won't be reading all of these Psalms to you. Some of them I will just be commenting on and making remarks on, and others I'll be reading verbatim. So just grab your copy of the scriptures and follow along, okay? Let's get started. As we begin to visit Psalm 9, we're immediately confronted with a word that in English is not well known, and that is the word muthlaben. It's a transliteration from the Hebrew, and it means death of the sun. Now, this is up in the superscription before you actually get into the verses of the psalm. Muthlaben, death of the sun. It was thought by some that the son's name might have been Laban, but I don't think this is correct. Ban means son in Hebrew, and the L sound, the La of Laban, the L sound is the letter Lamed. And when you find the letter Lamed preceding a noun, it means either two or four. Usually, the word the is indicated by the vowel underneath the lamed, which would render this for the son. But whose son? Which son? This has been a matter of much debate. Some have thought it refers to the death of Nabal, as we say in English most commonly, or Naval in Hebrew. That was the inhospitable miser who was the former husband of David's wife, Abigail in English. Others believe that this son refers to the infant who died at only a few days old, the first son of David, and Bathsheba. Another alternative is that it refers to the downfall of Esau and Amalek. Some have said it refers to the death of the giant Goliath. So take your pick. When you study what the sages have to say about this psalm, their belief about who the superscription is referring to guides their commentary. So if the sage believes that this was about Goliath, then they're going to view everything through the scrim of Goliath. If they believe that the psalm is about the infant son of David and Bathsheba, then their remarks and their commentary is going to be geared toward that. So do you ever do that? Use your saliva and clean the face of your children or whatever. Forgive me. That was kind of crass, but anyway. All right. So regardless, the tune to which this psalm was set was a well-known tune in David's day. It was a tune that was probably often used in the temple by the Levitical praise team, you might say. Now, structurally, Psalm 9 is one of those that uses a partial acrostic structure. That means that you have each verse starting with a different letter, acrostic. And usually the acrostic has some sort of meaning. It either spells a word or it has some sort of meaning. Well, in this case, every other verse begins with one of the first 11 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, minus the fourth letter, the Dalet. For some reason, that letter was omitted from the psalm. Now, Psalms 9 and 10 may originally have been a single acrostic poem in which the alternating lines beginning with successive Hebrew letters continued. In the Septuagint, which is the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, Psalms 9 and 10 constitute just one psalm. Like Psalm 8 was a psalm of praise to God for his marvelous creation, both Psalms 9 and 10 are hymns of praise to God for his attribute of righteousness and for his great goodness to those who love him. The key themes of Psalm 9 are as follows. One key theme is praise and thanksgiving, and this is revealed in verses 1 through 2. David starts out his psalm, as he often does, by expressing his joy and praising God for God's name, his wonderful, righteous name, and for the many wonders which he has done. And this, by starting the psalm with praise and thanksgiving, this sets a tone of gratitude for the whole psalm. And it's gratitude for both God's goodness and for his great might. And then a second theme that we see in this psalm is God's justice and his sovereignty. And we see this expressed in verses 4, 8, and 16, most pointedly. And along this theme, David speaks of God as the righteous judge, the completely righteous judge, talking about how he protects the righteous and how he punishes the evildoers, the wicked. And then a third key theme is refuge for the oppressed. And before I go on, I just noticed that my link to Facebook is not working this morning. And so I'm going to try and fix it. I don't know if I can or not, but I'm making an effort to do that right now. I don't know if I'll be able to. Let me see. Yeah, I just really don't know what's going on there. I guess I'm just going to have to investigate it later. So, but something's going on there. And I wondered why my viewership was down this morning. I guess my Facebook people can't get in. And I didn't notice that was a problem until we started. But at any rate, sorry for the digression there. All right, so a third theme is destiny of the wicked. And we see that in verses 5 through 6 and 15 through 17. David was able to divinely foresee the ultimate destruction of the wicked and the nations that oppose God. He was able to see that. You know, the sages say that Yaakov, Jacob, the patriarch Jacob, was able to see the end of the age as well, but that he was instructed not to reveal that. So David was a prophet as well as a priest. Wasn't a priest. He was of the tribe of Judah, but he was a king and a prophet as well. So another theme, the fourth one, is hope for the needy. And we see that in verse 18. David assures us in this psalm that the needy will not be forgotten and that the hope of the poor will not perish. And then finally, the fifth theme is a call to us to zachor. Zachor is a verb in Hebrew that means remember. A call to us to remember the faithfulness of our God. He encourages us to remember God's mighty deeds of the past, to recount them, to tell them to others, especially to our children. And he emphasizes the importance of trusting in God's character and in God's promises. Now, this psalm has several architectural features that are significant. For example, in the first 8 verses, the throne of Father Yahweh is mentioned 3 times. In verse 9, he's described as a stronghold, which is kind of an architectural feature, isn't it? Like a throne is sort of an architectural feature. But a stronghold, the kind of stronghold mentioned here is the kind of spiritual stronghold that you actually want, not one that is demonic or crippling, but one that is life-giving and full of hope. He's a tower of strength. This is the first mention of a promise that is often seen in the Psalms, and that is the theme of God being a strong help for those in times of trouble. We will also see and explore it more deeply in Psalms like Psalm 18, Psalm 32, Psalm 37, Psalm 46, Psalm 77, and Psalm 91. And then we have another architectural feature in verses 13 and 14, where gates are mentioned. Now, we in this modern day don't understand the concept of city gates because we don't have them as architectural features of our cities. In the days of the Bible, cities were surrounded by high, thick walls. That was a lot of diphthongs, wasn't it? High. I don't know where I was going with that. Sorry. But the gates were set into these high, thick walls. And they were an important part of the stronghold that guarded the city for at least 2 reasons. First, these gates controlled who entered and exited the city. So physically, the gates protected the city in that way. Secondly, it was at the city gates that the Hebrew elders, those wise ones, adjudicated civil matters of God's laws into their lives. So these gates mentioned in verse 14 were places that brought life to the people. By contrast, the gates in verse 13 are, quote, the gates of death. David praised Father Yahweh for raising him up, a resurrection reference, from those gates of death. In verse 14, we find a very rare occurrence in Hebrew, the word kaneni, which is translated as mercy or grace. But in the spelling of this word, they used 3 consecutive letters, nun. Nun is one of the Hebrew letters, and it's very rare to see 3 nuns right together in a word. And why use a 3rd nun to spell this word? Well, it was done for effect, basically. Let me give you an analogy. If you're astounded or amazed by something, you might go, whoa. But if you're extremely astounded or extremely amazed, you might go, whoa, right? So that is similar to what's happening here with these 3 nuns close together. So it's done for effect. It's done to convey that David is asking for an extra large heaping helping of God's favor, mercy, grace. Chesed is the Hebrew root for that. In verse 16, we find another less familiar term, and that term is higayon. Here it appears in conjunction with a more familiar term, selah, which means to pause and reflect. Selah means to just stop, pause, and reflect on what you just read. I heard a pastor say one time that Selah means stop and say, well, how about that? Higayon's meaning is less certain. It may be a musical instruction, such as making murmuring tones on the harp. I'm a musician, and I love how melody, harmony, and rhythm can be skillfully used to intensify the meaning of the lyrics of a song. Or it has been proposed that this term also means to pause and meditate deeply on what was just said, kind of like Selah, right? In verse 16, the psalm is saying, and I paraphrase, consider this deeply. The nations acted deviously and deceptively. They dug a pit for and laid traps for the righteous. However, they will fall into their own pits and become ensnared in their own traps for the righteous. They will become ensnared thusly according to God's sovereignty. Now, in your translation, the word pit is probably not capitalized, but there is a double entendre going on here. Dual meanings, layers of meaning. In Jewish thought, the pit, capital P, is a proper name for Gehenna, or you might say hell. The sages tell of a question posed by the Gentile multitudes, that is, the nations, that is, how will hell be large enough to hold all the evil people? God's answer, again, according to the story, was that as the numbers of people headed there grows, the place itself will expand. In other words, every sin sinned digs the pit a little deeper. Not a pleasant thought, but something to think about indeed. Many of the same themes that we see in Psalm 9, we see amplified and expanded upon in Psalm 10. Now, Psalm 10 has no superscription, which also lends credence to it being a continuation of Psalm 9. For example, Psalm 9 speaks of the wicked, but in Psalm 10, the wicked are more vividly described. This psalm is directed at no one individual, but it is instead a look at everyday interactions with degenerate people, someone who has thrown off the yoke of God's moral law. According to Ashkenazi tradition, that's Jews from Europe, this psalm is often recited during the 10 days of awe between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Look at some of the attributes of the wicked taken from Psalm 10, verse 2. Arrogant. Verse 3, boastful, lustful, greedy, hates God. Verse 5, prosperous. The prosperity God brings to the wicked does not satisfy their souls. It brings them no joy. Their greed only increases. As for getting away with his evil, in reality, God is just giving the wicked enough rope with which to hang himself. Also, being allowed to get away with wickedness is by no means a sign of God's favor. Quite the opposite, in fact. God sees no point in disciplining a person who's no longer capable of learning from it, profiting from it, or making repentance from his evil deeds. In verse 6, we see the word delusional used to describe these people. In verse 7, a cursing mouth, deceitful, oppressive to others, unjust. Verse 8, murders the innocent. Verse 9, mistreats the poor. Now notice that I skipped verse 4 in this list above, and I did so because I wanted to expand on that a little bit. I wanted to tell you a little bit more about the Hebrew language and how it expresses the concept of anger. Literally in verse 4, what is translated in the complete Jewish Bible as, quote, the wicked in his arrogance, end quote, is in Hebrew, literally, the pride of his nose. I guess you see why they changed it. But that's a Jewish euphemism, the pride of his nose. Well, in English, we would read such a literal translation and we would think, what does a nose have to do with anything? Well, sometimes in Hebrew, the word nose is synonymous with face because, particularly in Semitic people, the nose is the most prominent feature of the face. Furthermore, an arrogant person will often lift his or her nose heavenward in his or her pride. And when a person is angry, their nostrils will often flare to allow him or her to breathe more heavily through the nose. This leads to the term in Hebrew, a burning nose, which is commonly used to express that a person is angry. The psalm ends with the affirmation that God loves the humble person, as this is the opposite of the prideful wicked, and that he will advocate for and give justice to the helpless, orphans, the poor, and the downtrodden. Now on to Psalm 11. I had not really considered this until reading the introduction to this book that I'm using in these teachings. Here's volume 1. But the sages contend that there's no person in Scripture in the Hebrew Bible who was more afflicted than David. It began with his birth. Now, I think back to my 2 sons, who I had the privilege of getting to spend a lot of time with yesterday in a very sad setting. But I think back to when my sons were young. My younger son always wanted to be the firstborn. I can't explain why that is, but he would literally get very angry about not being the firstborn. David was the youngest of the sons of Jesse, and Jesse had a lot of sons. When the prophet Samuel came a-calling, looking for the next king of Israel, no one even thought to call David in from the sheep field. Even Samuel's eyes were blinded to David's potential. Then, after David was anointed king of Israel, he did not immediately take the throne. No, it was decades before he took the throne. He was, in the interim, pursued, persecuted. It seemed that no one had so many enemies, from the Philistines to King Saul. Oh, you might say, Job. Yes, but Job's trials were relatively short-lived compared to David's, as were King Hezekiah's, another Jewish king who had a lot of trials. David's life, though, was what you might call an endless succession of misfortune, to quote page 34 of the introduction. Even in his old age, his sons were trying to kill him in order to take his throne. With Psalm 11, the sages do not agree as to what this particular terrible event is that prompted David to write this psalm, but there was some terrible event. And as we will see, it is a chronicle of a treacherous enemy, one who desired to use slander in order to undermine David. I don't know about you, but when I was in a career, I was slandered often. Anytime you're in a position of leadership, you're going to be slandered. I'm just telling you, if you have the gift of leadership, just know it. You will be slandered. I read a leadership book one time that said, at any given time, 8% of the people are going to be against you. On any given issue, on any given topic, 8% of the people are not going to agree with you. They're going to be against you. So it just comes with the territory. But this particular psalm describes these evil men who were undermining David, and they looked at David's tribulations and they incorrectly interpreted these events as a sign of God's disfavor, as well as invitations from God to take David's place as ruler over Israel. Remember, we talked last week about the man who was Bathsheba's grandfather, who felt that because he had a dream that his offspring would sit on the throne of David, he thought it was talking about him. Remember that from last week? Yeah. So maybe this was about him, this particular psalm. At any rate, let's read the psalm, which was designated in the superscription for the conductor, the leader, the director of music. Let's read together. In Adonai, I find refuge. So how can you say to me, flee like a bird to the mountains? See how the wicked are drawing their bows and setting their arrows on the string to shoot from the shadows at honest men? If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? End quote. Let me step aside and say, what was in the quotes is what the evildoers were saying to David. Now, this is David's response. Adonai is in his holy temple. Adonai, his throne is in heaven. His eyes see and test mankind, humankind. Adonai tests the righteous. Hello. But he hates the wicked and the lover of violence. He will rain hot coals down on the wicked. Fire, sulfur, and scorching wind will be what they get to drink. For Adonai is righteous. He loves righteousness. The upright will see his face. Starting in verse 1, there is a time to flee. If your house catches on fire, you better flee. You may see that as running away from a problem, but it's also self-preservation. But an example of this in David's life would be when David fled Jerusalem as Absalom's, his young gun son's, mutinous army was approaching the city with the intent to overthrow the king. We discussed this last week in the previous lesson. However, oftentimes we run from our problems when what we need to do is to stand and face them, stare them down, refute them, rebuke them, conquer them through the power of God who lives within us. It seems that the latter was taking place here. The enemies were counseling David to run away with the intent of shooting him down as he fled the scene. Does David do that? No. Instead, David's response was to begin the psalm by affirming that Adonai is in his hiding place. And then in verses 4-7, he went on to affirm God's sovereignty, specifically in how he tests the righteous. It is in love that Father Yahweh does this. We see this in verse 7, the kindness, the chesed of God manifested in plagues and punishing rods. Look at verse 5. Adonai tests the righteous. So if you are being tested, know that you are loved. Sounds very contradictory, doesn't it? So does David's response. Our natural response is to whine, moan, groan, complain, etc. That's not what David does. As the sages have pointed out, quote, it's not so much what David said in the Psalms, it's when he said it, end quote. Psalm 12 spoke of a future era in which the wicked would completely overwhelm the poor and those unable to fight for themselves. It foretells of a time when evil will seem to have totally taken over. The last verse speaks of wickedness being so generally tolerated in this evil generation that the wicked parade themselves, strutting down the streets. I ask you, do we live in that evil day described in this psalm? Are we the evil generation described in verse 12? I don't know for sure, but it certainly seems like it. Think about the gay pride parades, for example, where people in varying stages of nakedness gyrate down the parade route, making lewd movements that simulate fornication. Or vile demonstrations where women, screaming for the right to kill their babies, march in the street wearing costumes which look like the female reproductive organs. Hideous evil. Evil parading itself in the streets? I think so. Maybe we are there. The sages say that David foresaw this as a time when the house of David would be threatened with extinction. More prophesying by David. David understood that Hasatan, the Satan, would try to stop the coming of Mashiach, the coming of Messiah, by wiping out the Davidic ancestral line. Perhaps this is why in verse 2, David said, quote, "No one godly is left. The faithful have vanished from humankind," end quote. Father Yahweh had, through the Davidic covenant, promised that Mashiach would be born via one of David's descendants. Indeed, this is what occurred as Mary, the mother of Yeshua, was descended from Nathan, one of David's lesser known sons. There actually was a time when the Davidic line was nearly extinguished. Do you remember when that was? If you begin counting with Solomon, David's immediate successor, and count forward to the 8th generation of David's dynasty, you will come to an evil queen named Athaliah. Had it not been for a servant who squirreled away the young prince, Josiah, there would have been no living descendant of David to sit upon his throne. It is because this near miss happened in the 8th generation that Psalm 12 has been designated Shir El Yom, which is Hebrew for song to the day, for Shemini Atzeret, which is the 8th day of the Sukkot festival. There's that number 8 again. This psalm has a superscription. It was to have been given to the conductor, the director, as was the previous psalm. And then there is a reference to, quote, the Sheminis, end quote. Did you notice that this word is very similar to Shemini in the title of the 8th day, Shemini Atzeret? That is because the number 8 in Hebrew is Shemini. Therefore, the Sheminis refers to an 8-stringed instrument. All right, let's look at this psalm together. Psalm 12. You ready? For the leader, on Sheminit, low-pitched musical instruments, maybe? A psalm of David. Help, Adonai, for no one godly is left. The faithful have vanished from humankind. They all tell lies to each other, flattering with their lips, but speaking from divided hearts. May Adonai cut off all flattering lips and the tongue that speaks so proudly. Those who say, quote, by our tongues we will prevail. Our lips are with us. Who can master us? End quote. Because the poor are oppressed, because the needy are groaning, I will now rise up, says Adonai, and grant security to those whom they scorn. The words of Adonai are pure words, silver in a melting pot set in the earth, refined and purified 7 times over. You, Adonai, protect us, guard us forever from this generation. The wicked strut about everywhere when vileness is held in general esteem. If you've lived long enough, you've encountered people with double hearts, as referenced in verse 3 of this psalm. At times, we may even have behaved as one of those. But I'm talking about, and these verses are describing people who make this a lifestyle. They practice this sort of duplicity and they live this dichotomy on the regular, as the expression goes. They say one thing and they don't even seem to know when they're lying. If you go to a prison and you ask 100 prisoners if they are guilty of the crime that they are said to have committed, 99 out of 100 will tell you that they are not guilty. My mother used to work in a prison. She was a teacher in a prison. She taught special ed classes there. And that was her testimony. She would say, those who have been convicted by far have deceived themselves into believing that they are not guilty. These sorts of people live one way in public and another in private. They speak one truth, and then in another context, they speak another, whatever they think is going to benefit them the most. It's not schizophrenia, a mental illness of multiple personalities. It is a spiritual illness. These people are the original silver-tongued devils, using their words to deceive. With glib words and smooth talk, they cover up their insincerity. I think we see a lot of this in our modern day, especially in, and I'm going to pick on them, yes I am, some of the news media outlets. Right now, in current times, for example, there's a lot of brouhaha over the tariffs that our current president has imposed on foreign countries, and the resulting effect it has had in the past few days on the U.S. stock market, causing it to drop 7%. Now, you would think from listening to the more liberal news outlets, the mainstream media, that the sky was literally falling. However, it is a fact that in 2022, the U.S. stock market dropped 19%. And we never heard a peep from the liberal mainstream media about that. It was just like, oh, stock market dropped. It's a correction. Double standards are pretty much the norm in our country today, whether you're talking about accurately reporting a news story or using an issue as a political weapon by turning the story deceptively. Do you see what is meant in describing such people as those who believe by our tongues we will prevail? Our lips are with us. Who can master us? And you know what? These wield tremendous influence in our culture. Another place this type of duplicity is seen is in the American judicial system's double standards, where the law is not applied equally to all parties. If the accused is of a different worldview than the judge, for example, then frequently the judge loses the ability to be impartial and to apply the law equally. By contrast, David describes the words of the Lord God, our Father Yahweh, in verse 7. In Hebrew, when you see the word heart applied to Father Yahweh, it is never spelled with two baits. Bait is the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it looks like well, I'll draw it for you. It may appear backward on your screen. It looks like a little house. In fact, the letter bait sounds like the word bait, and it looks kind of like a house. And it's backward. Sorry about that. You know what the camera does? It makes everything a mirror image. If there's a little dot in the middle of this letter, it has the B sound. If there's no dot, it has the V sound. All right, enough of the Hebrew lesson. But when you see the word heart applied to Father Yahweh, there's only one bait in the word. That's because Father Yahweh's heart is singular and holy and pure, as are his promises. Now look at verse 7. The words in other translations, sayings, or reliable promises of Yahweh are pure. The sage Rashi says that unlike double-minded men, Yahweh has the power to do his own will, to fulfill his promises, which are compared to silver refined, which means silver that has no dross at all, no impurities, no flaws. The use of the number 7 in this context does not literally mean exactly 7 times. In Scripture, particularly the Hebrew Bible, the number 7 connotes perfection or completion. It's often used to mean something that has been doubled or tripled or redoubled many times over. Do you recall in the Brit Chadasha, the New Testament, how many times Peter asked Yeshua how many times that Peter, should forgive a fellow brother? Peter suggested 7 times, and we non-Hebrew speakers thought he literally meant 7 times. Nope. He was seeking a specific numerical answer from the master, but he was using 7 in this redoubling context. Yeshua answered him with a tremendously redoubled answer when he replied, 70 times 7. In other words, don't keep count. Clear the ledger. The last psalm we'll explore today is Psalm 13. Have you ever lived in exile? Perhaps you've been a missionary, you've lived in a foreign country, a foreign culture, but that would be by choice. There's no choice in exile. I would not say I've lived in exile. Excuse me. But I have lived in another American culture, a culture that was very different from the one that I was reared in from childhood. Born and raised in Appalachia, I lived for a few years in the Midwest, where I was teased frequently about my speech, where grits were practically unknown, as well as was sweet tea. The Hebrew word for exile is galut, and sometimes you'll hear Jews refer to the galut. They're talking about the exile. It does not describe an invasion of a foreign power that allowed the Jewish people to remain in their land. No. It has the connotation of being ripped out of their homeland and cast far away. Famous Jewish sages Rashi and Radak say that this psalm is prophetic on David's part and that it is dedicated to these future exiles of the Jewish people. The Hebrew nation was in exile more than once. Can you name the 4 times? Well, they went down to Egypt for over 200 years before the Exodus. There were only 70 of Jacob's family members then. And later on, The 10 northern tribes basically exiled themselves from the Levites and the 2 more southern tribes, which came to then be called Judah. And then it was not long after that that the 10 northern tribes, which were called Israel, were then hauled off to Assyria to become scattered all over the vast Assyrian Empire. And then about 250 years later, Judah followed suit due to its ever-increasing apostasy, being judged by God, who allowed them to be exiled to the Babylonian Empire. And then the worst exile of all happened in 70 CE. The last temple was destroyed by the Romans, and then the Judeans, the Jews, were scattered all over the Middle East, and some believe up into Europe, over as far as Eastern Asia, and so forth. Now today, although most of the world's Jews live in Israel, there's still a sizable percentage that is still in exile. Let's read Psalm 13 now. For the leader, a psalm of David. How long, Adonai, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I keep asking myself what to do with sorrow in my heart every day? How long must my enemy dominate me? How many how longs? 4. How many exiles? 4. Going on with verse 3 now. Look and answer me, Adonai, my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. Then my enemy would say, I was able to beat him. And my adversaries would rejoice at my downfall. But I trust in your grace. Rejoices as you bring me to safety. I will sing to Adonai because he gives me even more than I need. You can't see it in this translation, but in the Hebrew, well, I guess you can see it in this translation because I counted it off. But you can't see the Hebrew word here, how long. It's ad anah, Adonai. Ad anah, my masters. And again, he says it one time for each of the 4 future exiles. Can you hear his despair? It is clear David felt forgotten by God, even though we don't know if there was a specific incident that precipitated his writing this psalm. Have you ever felt forgotten by God? So forgotten that you just wanted to die, as he said in verse 4? Apparently David did. His melancholy was that deep. Look at me, David implores God. Answer me, David beseeches God. Enlighten my eyes, David begs in anguish. The sages say that this last plea is an impassioned request for tremendous spiritual enlightenment. Enlighten my eyes. We see similar language in Psalm 19, verse 9. Quote, the law of the Lord is flawless, enlightening the eyes, end quote. And in Psalm 35:10, quote, by your light we shall see light, end quote. Do you see any rescue answers from God to David between verses 4 and 5? I don't. It's not like the heavens opened up and choirs of angels sing and brilliant light shone all around and deliverance fell like the soft petals of a cherry tree during a hard spring rain. My cherry tree looks beautiful right now. Can you see that? Probably not. See the petals on the ground? Sorry, the picture wasn't better. No, that did not happen. It didn't happen. Even though he cried out for answers and for God to at least turn his face toward him, we don't see David getting any of that, do we? Yet, something did happen. There was a change in David's attitude. God did enlighten David's eyes. Look at David's beautiful affirmation in verses 5 and 6. So much humility here as well. There are 4 of these, as I mentioned earlier, like there are 4 how longs at the beginning of the Psalm. So you had the 4 how longs, you had the 4 exiles, and now you have the 4 beautiful, humble affirmations. Here it is in Hebrew, and I have to put on my glasses to read Hebrew. I can read the English without them, but the Hebrew, I've got to have them. Those little nekudot, they get me. Va'ani bechastka batati. I should have rehearsed this beforehand. Yageo libi bishu ateka ashira la Yahweh ki gamal alai. I guess I got better as I went along. That's verse 6 in Hebrew. But I trust in your grace. My heart rejoices as you bring me to safety. I will sing to Adonai because he gives me even more than I need. I trust. I rejoice. I will sing because I know that my God supplies everything I need. Not all my wants, but my true needs. Well, we are out of time this morning on Mishkan Katan. I hope our study of Psalms 9 through 13 blessed you today. I've got to run, but I hope that your Pesach is a blessing. I'm going to be hosting a Seder here on the 12th, and I'm so excited about that. With everything that's been happening, I've not had a whole lot of time to start preparing, but I'm going to kick it into high gear this afternoon. Have a blessed Pesach. Have a blessed Resurrection Sunday coming up. I'm so excited for that, for these days, these Moedim that the Creator, our Father Yahweh, told us to keep. Until next time, shalom, shalom, lehitraot. If you missed today's show or want to watch it again, or want to tell someone where they can watch this episode, go to lambnetwork.tv, where you will find the show and all the other live Lamb Show archives in the on-demand section of the website. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to tell someone about the Messianic Lamb Network. We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussions, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the lambnetwork.tv website. I'm Gena Hood, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.